And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Mark Plotkin from the Amazon Conservation Team, noted ethnobiologist, author, conservationist, etc. And I also want to, of course, plug this book, which is not showing up, but it's Mark's new book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know. And I want to say it's the Goldilocks length. So it's long enough for a couple weeks of a graduate class, but it is not so long that the undergraduates will complain about it much. So it's perfect for your classes this fall. It's the Goldilocks length. It's beautifully written, and it's an excellent book. Thank you so much for doing that. And Mark, thank you so much for agreeing to come and speak here and participate in this, in the Congress. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. I've never been compared to Goldilocks before, but I'll take it as a flattering comparison. I first met Chris on the City of the Lost Monkey God expedition, along with press, an expedition run by Bill Benenson and Steve Elkins. And so it's nice to circle back and re-meet Chris in the Amazon. I'm Mark Plotkin. I'm an ethnobotanist. Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team. We're on the web at amazonteam.org. I'm going to cover a lot of ground this morning. So any additional information you need, check our website, or feel free to email me or enter some questions in the comments. I have the honor this morning, at least this morning on the West Coast, of dedicating this talk to William Denneman. Bill Denneman, I've been admiring his work, studying his work for over 40 years, and I don't think I've ever had the privilege of being part of a symposium with him. So I hope he's watching, but even if he isn't, hats off to you, Bill, and appreciate your many decades of leading the way, and many of us are following your footsteps. Now, I want to start with a little bit of a contrarian notion. I am second to none in appreciating the value of studying the Amazon from the air. I'll give you some examples of that, but you know, when you fly, you need two wings. And in the case of conservation in the Amazon, I've been doing this a long time. You need that eye in the sky, and you need those feet in the mud. And I want to give you some examples of that today. So if we could have the first slide, please, Antonio. So this is the title of my talk, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know. I want to pull back the lens a little bit and give you a broad perspective on why I think the Amazon is important, in addition to how we at the Amazon Conservation Team are partnering with fellow academics, NGOs, indigenous peoples, peasant peoples in Amazonia and elsewhere to protect biodiversity and culture. Next. So again, I want to give the website address. It's amazonteam.org, or you can always look us up on my name, Mark Plotkin, and we're pretty easy to find. Next. I think one of the reasons that Chris invited me to speak is we specialize in producing what we call these storybook maps, and have covered a variety of topics of relevance to many of the talks you've already heard and some of the ones you will be hearing, in terms of combining Western science with indigenous wisdom. In this case, it was with the legal aspects, where we've been very successful under the leadership of Carolina Hill of Amazon Conservation Team in legalization, that is land titling of indigenous territories. So again, this is the today. This is what I hope you look at after the talk. Next. Another example of this eye on the sky and the feet in the ground and the paddle in the river is this incredible Amazon gold mining map from Suriname, Dutch Guiana, northeastern South America, spearheaded by one of our great cartographers, Rudo Kemper. And both of these, as well as some of the others I'll be referring to, really merit looking at on your own, and don't look at it on a cell phone. There's plenty of bells and whistles. This needs to be looked at on a desktop computer. Remember those? As someone who's been working in the Amazon for many decades, like many of the rest of it, it's kind of disheartening how the Amazon was all over the headlines in the 80s and kind of dropped out for a few decades. And then it made it back to the headlines in 2019, but not for any good reason. It was the Amazon fires. And at last count, there were about 74,000 different fires. One of the underreported aspects of this story was that it had spread into the adjacent dry forest in the Southwest. And so these incredible forests that we all love were being burned to a cinder, and the biodiversity and the cultural diversity was reduced to ashes. And as we know, the current situation, the impact on the indigenous peoples of Amazonia is even worse, where they are being essentially exterminated in many areas aggressively. And I always have thought that you can't just worry about protecting biodiversity, you need to protect biocultural diversity. In fact, 25 years ago, Liliana Madrigal and I, refugees from the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, and Conservation International, thought there was a great niche available in conservation of Amazonia, and that was biocultural conservation, because the indigenous lands comprised as much as the protected areas, about 25% of Amazonia, and nobody was focusing on indigenous cultures. You had conservation groups focusing on trees and animals. You had the cultural groups like Cultural Survival, Survival International, focusing on the cultures themselves. But as we said way back then, you can't have forests protected well without indigenous peoples, and you can't have indigenous cultures protected well unless there's forests for them to live in. Now, on top of this Holocaust, you have COVID. Okay, and COVID's killing twice as many indigenous peoples as they are in the urban areas of the Amazon. This is, again, another part of the story that's underrepresented. And one of the most sad aspects of this whole undertold story is not just the toll it's taken on indigenous peoples, but in particular, it's taken on indigenous leaders. My old friend Aretana from the Xingu, one of the most forthright spokesmen in all of Amazonia, one of the most forceful spokesmen in the Brazilian Amazon, was carried off by COVID. And it's not just in the Amazon. My dear friend Santos of the Kogi peoples in northwestern Colombian coast was taken from us by COVID, as were other important indigenous leaders, like my old friend Playa Khan from the Kayapo. Of course, the biological origins of COVID are still being unraveled. The standing story, until proven otherwise, originated in a bat, jumped to something else, probably a pangolin, and then to the human species. This took place in Southeast Asia. However, one thing to remember is that the bats in the Amazon are as numerous as those of tropical Africa or tropical Asia. And all of these bats are covered in coronaviruses. Now, some would say don't publicize that because a lot of stupid people will go out and kill all the bats. But look at it this way. If these bats are surviving far better than we do, covered in coronavirus, what's their secret? What in their immune system is making them immune to these deadly viruses? So there are lessons to be learned from studying these creatures. And when I say I want to pull back the lens a bit as an ethnobotanist, I grew up with the idea that it's the ethnobotanist with his plant press following the shaman in search of new medicines. And that's still true. However, there are many medical lessons to be learned through cases like this with bats and coronavirus, or studying the toxins of Amazonia. For example, you have to remember that ACE inhibitors ironically originated from the study of the snake venom of a viper in southeastern Brazil. So the wonders of the rainforest are not restricted to plants and are by no means restricted to what shamans know and can teach us if they choose to do so. And we started this conference with Tom Lovejoy, an old friend and mentor of mine and a board member of the Amazon Conservation Team, calling the Amazon rainforest the greatest expression of life on Earth, which it is. But I also think it's important to point out that the biodiversity of Amazonia is not just locked in the forest. Remember that it was Janet Trinella working with indigenous peoples in the Colombian Amazon who identified 135 varieties of cassava growing in the gardens of just one tribe. And remember that cassava is one of the most important plants on Earth in terms of feeding tropical peoples, not only in Amazonia or South or Central America, but also in Africa. And we need to maintain this genetic diversity to fend off pests and diseases. Also, much of the biodiversity of Amazonia is, of course, found in the rivers as well. And in the course of putting together my most recent book, I talked to my old colleague, Michael Goulding, who pointed out that there are more fish in the Amazon than the Nile, the Congo, and the Mississippi combined. And we're still finding new species. So much of the coverage of Amazonia these days is about destruction, but to me, it's still a land of wonder and mystique. It was Pliny who said there's always something new out of Africa, but the same is true of the Amazon. It wasn't too long ago we found a coral reef at the mouth of the Amazon, totally unexpected in these cloudy waters. But again, Amazonia still has treasures and wonders to reveal. Now, many of the previous speakers have mentioned the many threats to Amazonian forests and rivers: COVID-19, cattle ranching, hydroelectric dams, gold mining, large-scale agriculture, logging, and fire. And those are the major threats. There are other threats like small-scale agriculture, like land grabs, which really can't be considered a small-scale threat because many of these things are linked. Small-scale agriculture cuts down forest, land grabbers move in, sell it off to large-scale agriculture, logging comes in, fire takes place in these degraded areas. It's just a terrible situation and a negative loop that feeds on itself. As Chris said, I have a new book out, relatively new book out, came out in the middle of the pandemic. But it covers the issue about, so more certain people paying attention than trying to jot anything down. And the idea was to get away from all the internet razzmatazz in the Amazon, which is full of nonsense, like every pharmaceutical drug we have comes from the Amazon, or the Amazon are the lungs of the earth. And then also not only provide information that's accurate and up to date, but has been scientifically checked and rechecked. Part of the problem with writing about the Amazon these days, and I'm sure most of the people tuning in know about this, is that every time you think you got a grip on something, some new paper, some new news story comes out. So I felt a bit like Penelope at the end of the Odyssey, unraveling the tapestry every night, because every time I think I got all the stories down, all the information updated, something new would come up. One example is that of Terra Preta, which the scientific consensus is that it was created by indigenous peoples using slow burning fires. It's a very compelling paper that came out, I think, about 6 months ago, which made a very convincing case that Terra Preta is actually the result of dams formed behind levees in the riverbank. I'm not convinced it's one or the other, but it just shows that even in this age of Amazonian destruction, which is happening faster than ever before, there's new stuff being discovered all the time. Here's one of my favorite examples, the giant blue tarantula from Guyana, found about 3 years ago. You know, most of the new finds in nature tend to be microscopic or fungal or beetles. But how do you miss a giant cobalt blue tarantula? And to me, this is important because it says, if you can miss something this striking and this spectacular, what else is out there? And not a year goes by, in fact, seldom does a day go by, our Trinidadian colleague, Carolyn Chabu, I think is at the University of Kansas, is finding new beetles, new species on average once every 3 days. So many more are out there. And again, to go back to this idea that we have to expand the value of nature much more than saying, if the Amazon doesn't have the cure for cancer, then, you know, why protect it? I think much of the future of medicines from nature is going to be poisons. I gave the ACE inhibitor example from the viper from Brazil, but there are insects that indigenous and peasant peoples avoid because they're toxic, because they're poisonous. The wandering spider, which is, in my thinking, the deadliest spider on earth. Have you ever seen somebody bitten by these? Understand why I feel that way. But there's a weird protein in its venom that they're looking at for erectile dysfunction. I mean, who knew? So again, it ain't just the plants. Even more promising than the poisons are the fungi, the least known group in all of Amazonia. And in the age of technology, which improves all the time, I think a lot of people don't understand that technology makes nature more important and more promising as a source of new compounds, not just medicines, but biodegradable pesticides, industrial products. So it's not the microchip or the medicine man. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. And I want to emphasize extremely importantly, is that this all needs to be done in an intellectually fair and equitable way. In the old days, drugs were found, brought to market. Indigenous peoples, local governments didn't share in the profits. Now, everybody knows that's no longer an acceptable way of doing business. And we need to be careful to balance the absolute necessity of doing this the right way without choking off scientific research because of people being paranoid, even though there's reasons for that paranoia. But again, I think there's a happy medium. Next. Electric eels are an example. The electric eel from the described by Linnaeus. That's how long ago we started studying. That's over 250 years ago. Keep in mind that Volta, since I know we have at least one Italian colleague tuning in today, ciao Umberto. Volta in Como studied electric eels, and that was one of the inspirations for the first battery. However, next, recent research by Ken Catania at Vanderbilt University found 2 new species of electric eels, one of which was 20% more powerful than any electric eel known. And that these are being studied for the creation of longer lasting, tinier batteries to implant in the human body for things like pacemakers. So even animals that have been studied for 250 years are still yielding new secrets. And if an 8-foot slab of meat that shoots out electricity can have been overlooked by scientists, imagine what's still out there. Okay, so this is a common sight. All of us have seen it. These are kapok trees that dot the rivers of Amazonia. These were long thought by many to be the tallest trees in Amazonia. But a Brazilian botanist several decades ago actually found a Denicia, the leguminous family, that was longer than, that was higher than kapok trees by quite a bit. And just 2 years ago, scientists working in the Jari Basin of the Northeast Amazon found Denicia that was 88 feet taller than any tree known in Amazonia. Now, we live in a world that when records are broken, it's by an inch, by a foot, by a fraction of a second. This is 88 feet taller than any other tree known. And again, to me, it's emblematic of how much is still out there to be learned. And as an ethnobotanist, this is how you learn it. You follow the indigenous peoples who not only have an incredible knowledge of the flora and the fauna, but almost every useful plant or animal that's come out of Amazonia was learned from indigenous wisdom. But learning from these people involves a humble and patient approach. This is Liliana, co-founder of the Amazon Conservation Team, with colleagues in the Xingu, where we started mapping about 15 years ago. This is when I was starting my work in the Northeast Amazon in 1982. And as I said, it takes a patient approach. Here I am with the same tribe of peoples 40 years later. So over time, one builds up relationship. And whether you're a botanist or zoologist, it takes time to learn the flora and fauna, but I would argue more so to gain the confidence of local peoples and have them begin to open up to you and teach you some of the secrets of the forest that you're not going to get if you just drop in and do your thesis project, spend 9 months, and go running off. And I'll give you a concrete example of that. This is a hallucinogenic frog. It's a green monkey frog, first found by my colleague Lauren McIntyre, who also found the source lake of the Amazon on the Brazil-Peru border amongst the Matses people. He was one of the first people to make contact with these indigenous peoples. And when I say he first discovered it, of course, discover is a loaded term, and it was discovered by the indigenous peoples themselves. At the time, nobody knew that there were hallucinogenic frogs in Amazonia, and certainly nobody knew that there were any indigenous peoples using hallucinogenic frogs in Amazonia. And not only are these offering new potential for psychiatric treatments, there are new antibacterial proteins in their skin. And in a perverse side note, their proteins have been used to dope racehorses because it's such an effective painkiller. And when they test racehorses for chemical doping, they definitely don't test for Amazonian frog slime, but that's what these are being used for. Now, here's the example of why you need to work with people for a long time. I gave a TED talk in Rio about a decade ago, and on the way back from Rio, I stopped in Suriname in this village of Trio peoples and was giving my TED talk to them. And when I showed the magic frog, the shaman to my right and your left, the one with the flashlight, he said, "Oh, we have that frog here." And I said, "No, you don't. That's from a country named Peru. You've never heard of it. 3,000 miles from here." And he goes, "No, we have that frog here." And I said, "No, you don't." And he said, "We do. And we use it for hunting magic." And I said, "I've been working here 30 years. And why didn't you never tell me about this frog?" And he said, "Well, you've been working here for 30 years and you never asked me about this frog." So this is why a quick sweep through these tribal cultures seldom allows the researcher to learn as much as he or she can over the long term. Now, in talking about hallucinogens of the Amazon, of the rainforest, of tribal cultures, and their value and potential value for global society, I want to start with the story of my mentor, Richard Schultz, who went to the Amazon in 41 for 6 months and went native for about 14 years. Now, this is another storybook map. This is done by Brian Hetler, one of our ace cartographers. Again, it's on our website, amazonteam.org. And it allows you to follow in Schultz's footsteps on this 14-year trek through the forest, up the rivers, making contact with peoples who had not seen outsiders, in search of entheogenic, in search of hallucinogenic plants and fungi and other healing notions. Schultz, who later went on to become director of the Botanical Museum at Harvard, had over his desk, in other words, over his shoulders, we were facing these two pictures. On the left, you had two yukunas snuffing tobacco during the Kayari festival, a ceremony to propitiate forest spirits and the fish of the rivers. And on the right, you see Chiribiquete, that I'll be talking more about. And the reason that these images have resonance for me today is that they're inspiration for our founding of the Amazon Conservation Team. On the left, you have culture. On the right, you have biology. And Schultz always said the best approaches to conservation seek to protect both by empowering the indigenous peoples themselves. Some of Schultz's most important work was in the headwaters of the Putumayo. The Putumayo is one of the main rivers of the Colombian Amazon. And a word about the Colombian Amazon, a lot of people don't get this. They sort of think of the Colombian Amazon as a bump on Brazil's back. The Colombian Amazon is bigger than New England. An acre per acre is probably the most diverse, biodiverse acreage in all of Amazonia, although I'm sure my Peruvian colleagues are rolling their eyes. In these headwaters, in the Sibundoy Valley, which we have mapped, and it's featured in some of our storybook maps. Next. He came into contact with the Kamsa peoples. This was their paramount shaman, Salvador Chindoy. And it was Salvador Chindoy, and you see his apprentice here with Schultz in the middle, that taught Richard Schultz about ayahuasca. Ayahuasca of the Malpig family was unknown outside of indigenous culture up until Schultz's work in this area in the 40s and the 50s. This once obscure Amazonian liana is now the focus of ceremonies from Istanbul to Israel to Indonesia. You can buy this stuff on the internet. But this is my favorite picture of mine by Stephen Foster, who is my favorite photographer of medicinal plants. And this has become so common that it's part of this great story of the mainstreaming of hallucinogens into Western medicine. Tribal shamans like Chindoy and in the Amazon, the Mazatecs in Mexico have long used hallucinogens, plants and fungi, as shamanic scalpels that allow them to investigate, analyze, diagnose, treat, and sometimes cure mental ailments that Western physicians cannot. In recognition of this, these plants, these fungi, these alkaloids are now being studied and used in places as diverse as NYU, UCLA by my pal Charlie Grobe, Harvard, Yale. Johns Hopkins is really the center of this research. They have a whole branch of the medical school devoted to this. This was established in part by my pal Tim Ferriss. It says it's fine to discover cures, but remember chronic conditions are our bread and butter. I put this in here because the use of these hallucinogens in its traditional context, and even now in the Western context, is allowing us to successfully cure conditions which Western medicine couldn't do previously. A shaman told me, when you fall down and hurt your knee at the age of 7, it gets better and it stops hurting. When you fall down and hurt your knee when you're 57, it gets better, but it still hurts because your body's holding on to stress. A shaman told me, what kills white people? Worrying about worry. And so what I've seen shamans do is to go in and remove this stress, remove these pains that are anchored in the human mind in ways that our own physician cannot. In addition to this, these shamanic plants and fungi are being used very, very successfully to treat so-called incurable diseases like anorexia, early onset Alzheimer's, insomnia, depression, end-of-life anxiety, end-of-life anxiety in cancer patients, and even PTSD. These hallucinogens are not panaceas. They don't always work. They don't work on everybody, but they're having significant rates of success in many cases. And this is really worth looking into further if you're interested. This is one of my most esteemed teachers, Don Luciano Matumbo of the Incano peoples of the Colombian Amazon. And this shamanic healing has become so popular in a sense that it's even received the most popular accolade of all. It's been lampooned in The Onion. Ayahuasca shaman dreading another week of guiding tech CEOs to spiritual oneness. And just to show you the topsy-turvy nature of the world in which we live, this is satire. I read an interview recently with some hotshot tech CEO who took ayahuasca and said, after doing that sacred ceremony, I was finally able to truly understand Bitcoin. You can't make this stuff up. I had the honor and privilege of spending time with the Yanomamo on the Brazil-Venezuela border about 20 years ago. And I was, of course, interested in hallucinogenic stuffs, which is what ethnobotanists tend to focus on. And just to go back to my original comment, you can't study this stuff from an airplane. But a concrete example, more recently from the Amazon, this is ethnobotanist Glen Shepard on the right with the Matsigenga people in the Peruvian Amazon. For years, researchers are hearing about piri-piri as a safe and effective treatment for as a contraceptive, a safe and effective female contraceptive, except it was a sedge, which tend to be chemically inert. They're just one family over from grasses. But you see in the lower left, the middle left side, that there's a fungus that has attacked the sedge. And that's the secret. This fungus is related to ergot claviceps, which is highly psychoactive, long been used for obstetric problems going all the way back to the Middle Ages. And Glenn and his colleague Keith Clay at Tulane found 7 or 8 new alkaloids related to the other ergot alkaloids in this fungus in the Amazon. And you have to remember that, once again, it was only this ethnobotanist who spent the time and learned the language who was able to find out this secret of what was really going on. And we'll see what the potential is. And just an aside, Albert Hofmann, the great natural products chemist of the 20th century, invented LSD while doing compounds modeled on those he extracted from the ergot fungus. So who knows what the future holds. I cover this in much greater detail in my podcast, Plants the Gods, which is a scientific and ethnobotanical approach to understanding hallucinogens and their value and impact on human society. And I state once again that despite all the hallucinogens we know and use, like the proteins from the frog slime, ayahuasca, mescaline from peyote, psilocybin from the mushrooms that Schultz found amongst the Mazatec in Central America, there are more hallucinogens out there in the rainforest waiting to be discovered. But that entails protecting the forest and helping helping the indigenous peoples protect the forest and their culture as well. It's in our benefit to do so. So let me conclude today by talking about how we at the Amazon Conservation Team are partnering with local scientists, local indigenous peoples, local peasant peoples to protect these forests and these cultures. This is the Anavilhanas archipelago in the Brazilian Amazon along the Rio Negro neck. This is one of the most important images I'm going to show you. This is taken over the Xingu Reserve. The Xingu at the top, you have 14 tribes of indigenous peoples living there. The bottom is where the white guys are in the state of Mato Grosso, not a single tree. Those little blobs at the lower right, lower left are just cows. So 20 years ago, knowing the power of mapping, we began working with indigenous peoples, but we took a different approach. We didn't make the maps. We trained them to make the maps. And you see the ACT cartographer at the top, right shotgun in the map. He's helping his indigenous peoples in Suriname, then spread across the border into Brazil, also the Trio peoples, with expeditions fanning out all through the rainforest. And this was so long ago, everybody was still wearing traditional dress. And what we found was that all the information in their heads would have stayed in their heads until this process gave them the opportunity to put it into the computer and put it on the map. A single map will hold hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites, and every one of these sites has a story behind it. But what are you going to do with this information, whether you're collecting it in the sky or on the ground? These are indigenous park rangers, and we've been running an indigenous park ranger force in the Northeast Amazon for well over a decade. So first, they begin by making the maps, then we use it to create a management plan. And then we create the guard force that patrols the area and is taking charge of their own cultural and environmental destiny. But we're introducing technology in a culturally sensitive way rather than just handing out iPhones and iPads and computers and say, you know, isn't this cool? Much of the work is being done by our cartographer, Brian Hetler, hidden in this picture on the left, working with the Kogi peoples. And the reason I put this in there is to show you that this approach is not just about indigenous peoples in Amazonia. The Kogis live on the Caribbean coast, and they took to this like wildfire. And we have used the type of information that's been collected, like locating the Yoko vine, which you see here in a photo by Schultz in the 40s. It's scraped into a paste to make a stimulant. Here it is in flower, and at our indigenous colleagues' behest, we partnered with the Colombian government and the Kofan tribe to create the Ingi Andi Medicinal Plant Sanctuary, the first protected area established at the request of the indigenous peoples to protect their most important medicinal plant. So it's an entirely new category of protected area. This was established in 2008. And we also have found it extremely powerful and important to reach out to adjacent cultures. The forgotten people of the Amazon, in my book, are the Afro-Amazonians, like this Saramacana Maroon. These are descendants of escaped slaves. This is my pal Johannes. He's a Saramacana Maroon from central Suriname. And so we have the indigenous peoples working with the Maroons to learn mapping, to trade agricultural secrets, and band together politically to help them try and get title to their lands. In the next slide, you see my colleague Minu, the director of ACT Northeast Amazon, working with Matawai Maroon peoples to teach them how to map their lands. I dearly love this picture because Minu is a native Surinamer, but she is of Hindustani extraction, teaching the Matawai people who are of African extraction in the middle of the rainforest. I mean, this is diversity personified. We also find that we have to work separately with the men and the women, or at least additionally with the men and the women, because the women hold a different landscape in their heads and hearts. So the men who are hunters tend to go out further into the bush, The women are the ones who do the culture. This is a generalization, but they will map agricultural lands in much greater detail than any male cartographer who ever found. And this is the storybook map we put together to tell the story of the Maroons, Lands of Freedom, done by Rudo Camper. And, you know, we all talk about Black Lives Matter. Afro-Amazonians are often in this story of the Afro-American diaspora. This is a magnificent piece of work. We're very proud of it. So please check it out on our website, amazonteam.org. As the trio peoples in the Northeast Amazon and Southern Suriname, these are them. But we also use this to teach adjacent tribes, like I said, the Maroons. And here on the left, in the next image, you see the trios, and then starting the mapping process. And on the right, you see one of the trios teaching one of the Maroons. So again, it's about building bridges and building alliances in the forest. And this whole issue of introducing technology in tribal societies can be done in a very negative and destructive way unless there's sufficient forethought. And I've seen missionary peoples, fundamentalist missionaries, provide technology to indigenous peoples as a way of convincing them of the superiority about all aspects of Western culture. So obviously, none of us want to do that. And with this mapping, we've been able to introduce technology in a culturally sensitive and supporting way. I want to finish in talking about uncontacted peoples. This is my friend Pone of the Ikorio tribe. They were first contacted about 30 years ago. I met them when they've just been taken out of the forest by missionaries. And just to show you how much these people really do know about the forest, it's no myth. They know 35 different kinds of bees and honey. We at ACT have a significant focus on protecting uncontacted peoples and leaving them uncontacted if they so wish. Our work has found 70 different isolated, non-contacted groups living in voluntary isolation. And one of the aspects that worries me about increased aerial surveillance of the Amazon is that these people need to be left alone, in our opinion, and the forest around them protected. Scenes like this are all too common. People fly low, frighten them, just to get this response. We found they were actually able to get a lot of information of who these uncontacted peoples are, but going back as far as the conquest. Another way is to work with people living in the vicinity. In fact, this is a park guard station we set up in Colombia to guard the mouth of the river because we knew there were uncontacted peoples living deeper within. With the recrudescence of the guerrilla movement in Colombia, it's threatened a lot of these types of efforts. But working with the surrounding tribes, the contacted tribes, that's the secret sauce. By working with these people, we get a better sense of the peoples further within and enlist their help and help empower them to protect their forest and their uncontacted brothers living within. And the protecting of these people in these forests has encouraged everything from keeping the illegal gold miners out to establishing and expanding current protected areas. I want to finish with Chiquito, which has been mentioned several times already, yesterday at least. This is my mentor Schultz doing the first scientific survey of Chiquito in the middle of the previous century. But one of the things that our research has revealed was that it was actually first explored scientifically by another Harvard man, Hamilton Rice, who did the first map in 1907. So there's some historical precedent that many people don't realize. And it was Schultz who worked in partnership with his Colombian colleagues to establish Chiquito as a protected area. We have partnered with the Colombian government and indigenous tribes to expand the reserve. It's home not only to a biological treasure trove of species that are extinct or endangered in many parts of the Amazon, but it's home to the greatest known treasure trove of pre-Columbian art. Thousands and thousands and thousands of paintings, very few of which have been extensively documented. And I want to conclude with a quote that ties us all together. Who lived in the Amazon? How many years ago? Was the Amazon an overgrown version of Central Park? And this is my answer, quoting Josh Barlow of Lancaster University. The influence of historical peoples occurred along gradients with high impacts and settlements and small and scattered Amazonian dark earth terra preta. I'm going to leave this with you. The bottom line is, no, I do not believe the Amazon was cut over and planted with cassava. And when I see these articles that say, oh, we're finding out that there used to be lots of peoples in the Amazon. Yeah, we found that out when Oriana came floating down the river in 1541. Dark earth settlements, rich riverine resources. Of course, there were many people living there. But the forest in which I've done so much of my work in southern Suriname, southern Guianas, never was the scene of any Machu Picchu's, never was the scene of these extended villages that early Brazilian and Spanish and Portuguese explorers noted. The Amazon is a mosaic. Trying to extrapolate who lived in the Amazon based on these dark earth tracks along the richest part of the Amazon River would be like 2,000 years from now, people digging in Death Valley and saying how many people lived in New York City. The Amazon's a big place. It's truly a mosaic biologically and culturally. And I'm excited as anyone to see these new finds, particularly in the Southwest and Bolivia, where we're finding these settlements and these gardens and these structures. But I do not think that the Amazon was highly populated from one end to the other. More importantly, I want to say that I really do believe that the future of Amazonian conservation is in the air, but only if it is partnered with efforts on the ground, particularly by the indigenous peoples, but also the peasant peoples, the campesinos, the caboclos, and researchers and biologists like ourselves. You need that partnership. It cannot be one or the other. 20 years ago, the leader of a large conservation organization puffed up his chest and told me, we can monitor every single tree in the Amazon. And I said, but what are you going to do when people start cutting it down? I'm still waiting for an answer. That's where we need indigenous park bird forces. That's where we need indigenous peoples empowered, trained, equipped, sometimes funded by peoples like ourselves. Partnership is the way to save the Amazon. Nobody can do it on their own. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that talk. I always just love your talks, and so there's a lot to unpack. And we have a couple of minutes here for questions, and I hope you'll indulge me.
Absolutely.
And also, thanks for the nightmare of that blue tarantula, which I'm sure I'm going to see tonight.
I hope so.
Craziest dream. Maybe crawling on my wall or something nuts. I do want to talk about that, the issue of how densely settled the Amazon was at the time of European contact. But I want to circle back to that. And I know we've talked about that before, probably over beers or something at some point. So, but one question I wanted to ask you, and it's something that like a lot of people have touched on, is how dramatic is the change between in the Amazonian environment between the time of, say, the first time you visited, or the first major time you were clocking what the environment was like, and the last time you went there. And then the second part of that question, I think, is how much of that change is due to human activity, and how much do you think is due to the climate crisis? So it's a two-parter.
About 10 years ago, I was in the Miriti Paraná, which is one of those remote rivers in the world, much less the Amazon. And I was walking through the forest with one of the chiefs who's wearing a breechcloth for a tribal dance. And he, with his machete, pointed to cassava that was clearly dying. And I said, what's going on? And he said, cambio de clima. So clearly, the climate's been affected long before we started paying attention. Ironically, the Kogis 30 years ago said, what are you little brothers doing down there? Our glaciers are melting. And everybody thought, oh, these guys don't even have shoes and wristwatches. What can they know? Right. So clearly the climate has already changed. And our worry is it going to start changing faster. Now, when I started 38 years ago, everybody I worked with was wearing a breechcloth. That's not true anymore, very seldom. Sometimes they wear it for tribal events or if it's a particularly hot day. So, it's none of our business what people choose to wear. The reason I have a problem with that is the people that I work with best were taught to put on pants by fundamentalist missionaries who told them that that was stupid and primitive and backwards. That's, of course, another whole other lecture. So it seems to me that clearly the climate is changing. I can't document the flora and the fauna having changed. There's a particularly striking study in my most recent book, but done by Oliver Phillips in England on the changes in lianas. Lianas seem to be getting bigger and growing faster, and they attribute that to increased carbon in the atmosphere. There's a saying, it's hard to understand history while it's happening. Well, the same is true of biology. So clearly change has come to the Amazon. And, when I started in this business, Chris, I like to say, I want to make the world a better place. Well, I got too many dents in my fender. Now I say, I want to make the world a less bad place. But, the idea that we're going to reverse climate change is less likely than to be saying we're going to be able to slow it or mitigate it down. That, I think, to me, has to be the immediate aim.
Right. Okay, I have a bunch more questions, but how do you think the participatory mapping is such an amazing, that's really an amazing, absolutely amazing piece of work. And here at the Earth Archive, we've had huge, long discussions with all of the regional coordinators about capacity building, showing people how to use the LiDAR data, but also having, asking them what they need from it. Because it's not, in some instances, that's not, it has to be driven by them. And how do you think having these high resolution LiDAR data and all the products from it, the DEMs and the whatever, will help those kinds of participatory mapping activities?
Well, that's a question that I could spend several days on. To me, a map is a map, except when it becomes an incipient management plan, except when it becomes training ground for a guard force, except when it becomes a means of finding and inventorying all the non-timber forest products, except when it shows where the garimperos are getting in and where you need to put up a guard post. And what we always say at the Amazon Conservation Team is we don't tell people what to do, at least we try not to. We want to empower them to make their own informed decisions. And so after we made the first map, the next thing they did was made another map on their own, no prompting from us, of where all the Brazil nut sites were. These are valuable non-timber forest products. That, to me, said the technology has taken hold. They're using it on their own for their own purposes. They weren't told to do it. They weren't asked to do it. It was their idea. It was their elbow grease and legwork that did it. So once again, it comes to the point where you have some people who used to say, oh, you can't give them technology because you ruin them. And then you have the flip side of it, which is techno bombing, where people come in and give them all these technical tools, and then they become hooked to it without being moored to what it's really useful for. So it's not up to us to tell them what to do with it and what not to do with it. It's to show them what can be done with it in a positive and constructive way. I'm from Louisiana. There's an old saying, if you're going to a knife fight, take a gun. Well, when these guys are sitting down with the government or sitting down with the gold miners, and they've got better maps than anybody else, it gives them a leg up. And I'm not interested in trying to play tricks on the government, saying, okay, we don't want you guys to have good maps, because usually we work in partnership with the government.
Right.
But when the Indians or the campesinos, or the caboclos, or the Afro-Colombians have as good a maps exist in the world, that's a very powerful tool.
Yeah. Well, that's something we'd like to help provide, to the best of our abilities, by open sourcing these records with capacity building and
well, I want to say one other
thing,
because it's so important. What has happened here is we get the young guys trained as cartographers, and all of a sudden they got to sit down with grandpa and find out why that river has that name, what great battle was fought there, where the fish spawn. And so it reconnects them to their living past in a ways where they're kind of taught by outsiders. Yeah, the old people, they don't have last names. They don't know how to write their first names. They're kind of primitive. The Western world has all the answers, and they see that these old people, their parents and grandparents, have a lot of answers and a lot of knowledge. So that's been a really heartening aspect of this work.
So I have one other kind of related question. This came up this morning actually and yesterday. And this is another topic of discussion that we've had, commonly had. And and you touched on it in your talk today. And that is the uncontacted peoples who are uncontacted by choice. And obviously we will probably document where some of those folks are. And we want to, keep those data confidential. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about, and we have mechanisms of doing that. But I was wondering if you could talk about those uncontacted people, their relationship to the contacted people around them, and how much longer you think that they can remain uncontacted.
Well, first of all, we adamantly work to not reveal the location of these people. And we do that in a variety of ways. But I want to emphasize it's not just about isolated peoples, that, in many of these mapping exercises, these people have found gold, or at least they know where the gold is. They obviously don't want to put that on the map. So part of the empowerment is saying it's your culture, it's your forest, you decide what to put on there, what not. And like I said, we work very closely with the contacted people, near the uncontacted people. And there are some people who criticize people like me, saying there are no uncontacted people, that they know there's an outside world that exists ever since the advent of the airplane over the rainforest in the 40s and 50s, but they choose to be isolated. They choose to live in isolated, voluntary isolation, whatever you want to call it. But I think what we're looking at here conceptually is a one-way street. They can come out whenever they want, but we should make it more difficult for outsiders to get in there. They run in Peru what they call photo safaris, human safaris, where you go in there and take pictures of recently contacted people. I have a real problem with this, and I would guess that most of the people, if not all people tuning in today, feel the same way.
Right.
So there is many complicated aspects around this, but keeping the outside world at bay has to be priority number one. Like I said, it's not us walling these people off and putting a fence around them like they're in a zoo. It's the one-way street thing. They can come out whenever they want. And some of them have come out because they've been shot at, their malokas have been burned. But, having missionaries or ecotourism guides tromping in there, we got a problem with that.
Okay, so the last thing, we're gonna leave the human settlement question off the table until we can talk about that over some beers again some in the future, and maybe after we've done a little bit of scanning, because I would like to hash that out with you. We've talked about that before, but the final question that I sort of do have for you is, what do you see as the ultimate contribution of the kinds of scanning projects that we're sort of attempting to do?
I think the aerial surveillance issue is fascinating. I think it can draw in people. It's more compelling than a lot of the tromping the forest in search of flowering orchids. However, it has to be seen as part of the equation and only part of it. I don't know of any successful protected area ever set up from the air without some sort of ground truthing and ground protection. So like Jesse Jackson, not going to be quoted much at this conference, would say it takes two wings to fly. You need the air, you need the aerial, you need the terrestrial. It can't be one or the other.
Absolutely. Well, and I totally agree with you. And I hope in the future that, we can work more closely with ACT as we begin these scans and help with capacity building and doing some of that ground truthing, that groundwork that needs to happen.
Well, I want to thank you, Chris, and I want to make it clear that, what I've said today is based on our experience. We do not have all the answers. We work with over 100 tribes. There's hundreds more that we haven't met or been invited to work with. We're in uncharted waters. Destruction and deforestation is happening faster than ever before. I don't want to be too Pollyannish, but I don't want to be too negative. Any glass that's half empty is also half full. So these types of technologies open new possibilities. But in Suriname, we have a saying, which is to any complicated problem, there is an answer which is both simple and wrong.
Well, thank you. It was so good to see you, Mark, and thank you again.